We have a final but an extraordinarily eloquent speaker, Walter Russell Mead. It's been my pleasure to host Russell during my previous assignment as ambassador in Ankara. He is an exceptional master of the English language. Whether you agree with the positions taken in the publication or not, the sad demise of American interest was a loss to those who value clarity in prose. Walter's written an exceptional book. It's been called magisterial in some normally quite critical sources of review. Ark of a Covenant. I'm reminded, Dennis, of your book, Doomed to Succeed. It is, in Russell's case, a lifting back, a pulling back of the lens to look at what were the demythologized origins of support, association with, identity with Israel. Is it shared interests, shared values, a mixture of the two? How does it evolve over time? Where does it go now? And given the discussions that we have had here today, I think there can be no more appropriate concluding observation than Russell asking you if you will once again pull back your capacious lens and give us your sense of these issues. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a real honor to be invited to speak in the company of people who have for so long played such a distinguished role in U.S. and Israeli politics, society, and diplomacy. And honestly, I feel a little bit intimidated. The only thing I think I have going for me is that I may be the first person in a long time to have written a book on the U.S.-Israel relationship without a single recommendation. It turns out, by the way, that's a great way to get good reviews. Don't make recommendations. And what I thought I would try to do today when talking about the U.S.-Israel relationship, and naturally the future, I would much rather talk about the past because I at least know something about that. Some of you may know what Yogi Berra said, that great American sage, that prediction is always dangerous, and especially when it involves the future. So one has to be careful here. But I'd like to give you a sense, first of all, from my study of the history of the U.S.-Israel relationship, what drives the relationship more than anything else really has been the perception of American national interest by successive American administrations. And if we think about it, when Israel had the moral high ground in the 1950s, when it was weak, when it was poor, when its enemies in many cases were much more formidable, the United States was not allied or aligned with Israel, actually worked with the British to try to force Israel to surrender the Negev as part of a plan. Israel couldn't buy American arms for cash money. So there was the idea that somehow, at that time, Israel arguably was what had the best case of its history for the moral high ground, a nation of refugees, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S. really was not particularly interested at the level of policy because U.S. Cold War policy believed that a relationship with Nasser was the best way to contain the Soviet Union, not only in the Middle East, but because Nasser, as the leader of a great modernizing post-colonial state, if he would accept the help of the United States in modernizing Egypt and building Egypt rather than the Soviet Union, the demonstration value of this would be global. So the United States actually does not become an ally or let's say aligned with Israel until 1973, by which time Israel had already won the Six-Day War, establishing itself as a great power in the Middle East and overcoming bitter and prolonged and intense American opposition, developed nuclear weapons capacity. So it's important to remember when we talk about this whole relationship that Israel did not become strong because it had an American alliance. It gained an American alliance because it had grown strong. And that is a fact, I suspect, that is much more in the minds of Israeli leaders when they are negotiating with Americans than it often is of American politicians when they are negotiating with Israelis. And all of us, I think, need to understand when we ask, why can't the U.S. get Israel to do this, get Israel to do that, need to remember that's not, that Israel began, in a sense, by defying the United States. The last thing that the cabinet of the Yishuv, the leadership group, did before they declared independence in 1948 was to vote to reject the Truman administration's request that they defer a declaration of independence. So the first act of a very weak Israel being attacked from all sides was to defy the wishes of what was at that time the unquestioned global superpower. They began as they intended to go on, I think. So when we see this, it applies to later administrations too. By and large, if you want to understand the policy of a given American administration toward Israel, look at the way the president and the people around the president see the American national interest globally, how they see the global situation, how they see America's interest in that situation. What do they see as the role of the Middle East in that American global interest? And then what is the nature of our relationship with Israel, and how does that either support or frustrate our broader interests elsewhere? And that is the way they look at it. Now, this can be confusing because American presidents use Israel policy as a way, a very effective tool of political signaling at home. So imagine you're President Biden and you wake up one morning and you just decide, you know what, the left is really angry at me and I'm worried I'm losing control of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. I got to come up with something, and I've just already spent all the money and I can't appropriate any more. What can I do? Well, one thing you can do is you can make a speech and say, I believe that the Palestinians deserve equal rights and security with the Israelis, and the entire progressive wing of the Democratic Party erupts in hosannas. Many of them say, well, I wish he'd do more, but at least it's a start, right? And you haven't spent a penny. You haven't asked a single diplomat or soldier to cross a hallway, all right? And yet you've achieved a very significant political result. On the other hand, if President Biden wakes up tomorrow and he thinks, people are tagging me as too left-wing, I could lose the center, my polls are down, I need to find a way to reach out across the aisle or something, you can make a speech and say, the state of Israel has a right to defend itself against terrorism, and I support that right. And again, half the country erupts into tumultuous applause. Right? And again, you haven't spent a single penny. You haven't dispatched a single airplane anywhere. You've made a speech, or not even a speech, you made a comment as you were getting onto the helicopter flying to Camp David. All right? So presidents have understood that in some ways the salience of Israel policy in American foreign policy overall is actually less than the salience of Israel rhetoric in the American political system on both sides of the aisle. And they have used it and still use it. And again, the shade of Yogi Berra is wagging his finger at me, but I will dare to prophesy they will continue to use it for political ends. Now that I think is one thing we can expect to continue, but if we ask, okay, can we get some more detailed thoughts about where the relationship is going? I think we can. Because if we look at American politics today, the politics of American foreign policy, the debate, what we can see is there is a general tendency in the American political system to downgrade the importance of the Middle East in American global strategy. There are some who say we should really not only just drop the Middle East, we should also drop Europe in order to focus on China and the Indo-Pacific. And there are people, no, we got to add more to China, but we really have to save Ukraine too. The Middle East is the orphan in that. And this contributing to that is a sense of deep frustration, I think, in the left and the right on the results of the American Middle East policy in the 20th century. People on the right who might have welcomed some of our military adventures in the Middle East are now, we're very unhappy with the results. And people more on the left who wanted to see the U.S. doing more to promote democracy in the Arab world and so on have been very disappointed in the results. There's not a lot of energy or consistency in the American political system to say, let's invest a ton more in the Middle East. And I think under President Biden and President Obama, there was an additional sense that what's the worst thing that could happen in American foreign policy in the Middle East? The answer is a war with Iran. Probably in their heart of hearts, though neither would ever say it in public, and I'm just guessing, that an Iranian bomb would be a terrible thing. But for a Democratic president to lead the United States into a war in the Middle East, would it break the Democratic Party after the Iraq War? Would it guarantee the rise of a party challenger, a peace party challenger in the primaries? Would Donald Trump, perhaps in spite of his past record on Israel policy, immediately attack you for starting yet another endless war? And so looking at those politics, not because you're a coward, not because you're a weakling, you really might come to the conclusion that, in fact, what you need to do above all is avoid war with Iran. And that will inevitably affect your Israel policy. And it doesn't matter what the American Jewish community thinks, what the American evangelical community thinks, etc. This is what you see as a matter of grave importance, not only to the national interest, but to your own personal political future and the future of your party and of many other things that you care about. On top of this, I think, adding to the frustration with the Middle East in American foreign policy, and if I were talking about this from the Middle East, I could talk a lot about their frustration with the United States, but I'm doing it from the American end, obviously. You're going to say that the Middle East is a place where it's of the past, really. The economies aren't growing. If you're a green activist, you're saying, and in 20 years, the world will transition away from fossil fuel, and all that oil in the Middle East will be completely irrelevant. And the economic power of the Arab states will go away, and of Iran will go away. So really, our best Middle East policy is to accelerate the transition to green energy, and just to kind of play a stalling game in the Middle East while we do that. By the way, this I think is one of the, I don't think the Arab countries are stupid. I think they realize this, and some of the Arab diplomacy recently of looking at China and Russia, countries which have absolutely no interest in stranding Middle Eastern oil assets, you see a rational response to what they perceive as a change in American policy. Now, I myself am not one of the people who thinks the United States should write off the Middle East or downgrade it. I actually believe America is a country whose interests are global. The Middle East, for the foreseeable future, remains an important theater of world politics from the pure standpoint of American interests. So I am not describing the future I advocate or hope to see. But I do think that we can expect the most likely course is, if they can, American politicians, by and large in both parties, will be looking for ways to reduce America's exposure in the Middle East. And that's going to have two consequences. It's going to make the U.S.-Israel relationship a bit more distant. Actually, I'll say three consequences. Another is, I think it will tend to promote the right in Israeli politics. That is to say that the perception that the United States is stepping away will increase concerns in Israel that we have to be security first, and also lower the perceived value of having a good moral reputation with liberals in the United States. So that, again, U.S. withdrawal from the Middle East tends to be actually bad news for both the Palestinians and sort of liberals in Israel, as well as, I think, what remaining supporters of democracy there are in other countries around the region. And if that is true, if we are seeing diminished U.S. interest and therefore changes in the policies, I think we're going to see a Middle East that continues to look the way it's kind of looking now, which is that all of the countries in the Middle East, including many who for a long time, both Israel and on the Arab side, have been largely focused on their American relationship, are going to start to diversify their portfolios because they'll think they have to. And I'm not trying to make a partisan point here about the Biden administration. I personally don't think they've done much to retard this, but I don't think it's a problem necessarily of their creating. It's American political society. And also, people in the Middle East look at the United States and they say, you elected George W. Bush and then you pursued one kind of policy in the Middle East. 8 years later, you elect Barack Obama, pursue an entirely different kind of policy. There were some overlaps, but in many ways a very different policy. Then in 2016, you elect Donald Trump and you followed a kind of policy. We're not quite sure what it was, but it was different from what you had before. And now you've got Biden and it's totally different. What are you going to do in 2024? What are you going to do in 2028? Do you have any idea who you are? And it means that the word of any American president in the Middle East, as elsewhere in the world, is sharply diminished in power. Because we don't know whether you're speaking for the United States of America or whether you're speaking for your majority, which we notice has razor-thin majorities in Congress, and we look at the polls and we don't know how long you're going to be there. So the diminishment of the American power in the Middle East, I think, has played a significant role in creating a Middle East that is less favorable to American sort of values and also less engaged in supporting American realpolitik priorities, both. We're sort of, in a more difficult position in both. Unless we change our approach in some ways, I expect that this will continue. In some ways, I honestly believe that the biggest victims of this may well be the Palestinians. Although in the chaos that could ensue, I think there'd be a long list of losers in the Middle East. In general, the transition from one hegemonic power system in a region like the Middle East to another is fraught with war, instability, civil strife, and many other things. It's unlikely to be a happy transition. We could get lucky, but that kind of luck is rare. And the Palestinians are the weaker party in their contest with the Israelis. And really since the 1930s, when the Palestinians were trying to get the British to sort of be their advocates and to play their hand to help balance their weakness vis-a-vis the Jewish population at the time, right on up to the present day, where, as we can see, the former Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority was asking us today, please, America, do the things that will give us legitimacy. That is, if you leave us alone in a room with Israel and what happens is based sheer on power politics, we need a third party in there, and we need a powerful third party. And as I say, I think the Israelis also will be less considerate about our wishes and sensibilities and so on and so forth. So, in a way, it's kind of paradoxical that as we try to take a policy, a more balanced policy, in part because we hope it will make us more popular in the Middle East, the perception of our weakness, or let's say the perception that either our will or our ability or both is diminishing for real engagement in the Middle East, means that countries like Russia, like China, like Iran, will play a greater role. And I'm going to leave you, I guess, having said some gloom and doom, I'll leave you with a really nightmarish scenario just to complete it. And I'm sorry, by the way, happy birthday, Israel. Let me actually say, I am very, very happy to celebrate 75 years of Israel. I would like to say I'll be here for the 150th. We'll see. But, all right, if I were Vladimir Putin and the war in Ukraine was going really badly for me, and it was creating problems for me at home, problems that might shorten my lifespan, all right, one of the things that would occur to me is that a nice war in the Middle East would be really helpful. Okay, that it would, it would double or triple the price of oil. It would create a tremendous crisis in Europe. An economic and political crisis might well make the Europeans rethink. It would force the Americans to not only argue with themselves about how many weapons are we giving to Ukraine versus how many are we holding for Taiwan in case those are needed. Now we have a third theater to worry about. All right? And I'm not doing it. And could he do it? There are things he could do. For example, take the more radical alternative. He could just help Iran get over that last little threshold, not only to the possession of nuclear weapon, but of some kind of a delivery system. Or he could do something even less dramatic and subtle. He could commit to sell Israel air defense equipment and airplanes that would deny Israel the certainty that if it attacked the Iranian nuclear program, it could get the kinds of results that it needs. And that might well force Israel into a preemptive strike against Iran, which, again, could only be helpful to Putin. So the slow decline of the American hegemony in the Middle East is opening the door to a future that I suspect will be even less pleasant than the recent past in the Middle East has been. But I honestly hope I'm wrong, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. And I will only note on your concluding a somewhat concerning note regarding Russia and Iran, there are many areas to question where Putin goes and what he does. But one area where I think Vladimir Putin will not go is to facilitate Iranian acquisition of a nuclear weapon. If Russia has demonstrated one consistent political position, it has been to welcome what we would call the international media's reporting of Israeli efforts to constrain the Iranian presence in Syria and en route to Lebanon. So we got a lot of things to concern ourselves with, including Iran's own potential decision-making on weaponization, potential. But Russian facilitation, that's one that I don't put at the high end of my priority worry list. I want to thank all of you again. First, those who have contributed to this event, those who were on the screen with us from away, those who are here with us in the hall. It was an exceptional day, and I think the discussions were quite extraordinary in their depth, in their frankness, not just in what questions were answered, but the questions that were posed that can't be answered right now, and in the dialectic that you heard between individuals who are deeply concerned with where all of these issues go, where they resolve, how they resolve, what happens if they don't. But I have to thank all of you in the audience. Your participation was most welcome. It's vital to the work that we do. As I said at the outset, we're a public-facing institute. Our role is to analyze, to recommend, but also to educate and present critical issues for those here in Texas and beyond who want to be informed, want to be challenged in asking questions themselves. Thank you all again. Have a very, very good day. And we will see you all at our next event. Thank you.